That should be a clap that I got up here, able to walk with my calf tear. Obviously the focus of my talk is on guild and pharmaceutical influence on diagnostic and practice guidelines in psychiatry, but the focus will be on institutional corruption. And I find this framework very, very helpful for a number of reasons. One is I'm often positioned as anti-psychiatry or anti-medication, and I'm neither. And I find the conceptual and normative framework of institutional corruption very helpful for avoiding those what I see as false dichotomies and blame, and for focusing instead on, okay, what are solutions for reform? So before I talk a little bit about what institutional corruption is, I just wanted to read briefly from a paper by Larry Lessig, who is the director of the center at Harvard that I've been affiliated with. And he writes, kindergarten ethics sees the world in black and white. There are good people, there are bad people. Good comes from the former, bad from the latter. But to grow up is to recognize that such simple links simply do not hold. The field of institutional corruption was launched to help ethics grow up. So what is institutional corruption? How can it help ethics grow up? Well, the way that it's differentiated from how we usually think about corruption, quid pro quo corruption, is that there's an improper dependence that results in systemic practices that are usually legal, and I would also add often perceived by the actors within the institution even as ethical. Nonetheless, these practices undermine the integrity of an institution or they weaken public trust. So what happens is that there's a bending of the original mission, which results from the normalization of behaviors that compromise truth-seeking. Now, in institutional framework corruption, the framework shouldn't be conflated with Thompson's seminal definition of conflict of interest, but it's very much related to it. And so I always like to show this slide because I think it's very important. What Dennis Thompson is doing here is emphasizing that a conflict of interest is not to imply research fraud or that a specific researcher is even, as he said, improperly motivated, but rather it points to this generic risk that a financial conflict of interest could compromise the research process or undermine public trust. And I think, we've heard for the last 2 days the way in which evidence-based medicine has been compromised by industry influence. And I think, personally, I think psychiatry could probably be the poster child for the way in which that happens. So it's not about the bad apple, it's about the bad barrel. So what the framework of institutional corruption does is it focuses on what are the perverse incentives that have developed over time? What are the economies of influence that have taken the institution, in this case, organized psychiatry, what I'll be talking about off course. So I'm going to be talking about the way in which both guild and pharmaceutical interests have taken psychiatry off course in terms of their diagnostic and practice guidelines. So let's take a look first at the diagnostic guidelines. DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, as many of you know, is considered the Bible of psychiatric disorders. So we have the DSM-4 and DSM-5 up on the screen. DSM-5 was published in May of 2013. And with increasing congruence with each iteration of the DSM with the ICD, the DSM really has a global reach. It's not just has such dominance in the U.S. Now, to its credit, after we did a study in which we pointed out the conflicts of interest between the DSM-4 panel members and industry, the APA developed a disclosure policy for the folks on the DSM-5. There are panel members and task force members. The task force members really have oversight over the panel members. The panel members are the folks that make the decisions about the specific disorders. So, for example, mood disorders or schizophrenia and psychotic disorders. Now, this slide is a little hard to see. The main takeaway is the black bars represent DSM-5 and the white DSM-4 and DSM-4-TR. In terms of conflict of interest, looking at the different panels. So the main takeaway is that despite increased transparency, not much has changed. In fact, here's just a brief slide where you can see the, just a brief overview. So you see, okay, there are certain panels where the members with financial conflicts of interest decreased. So in the DSM-4, all of the mood disorder panel members had ties with manufacturers of pharmaceutical companies that make antidepressant medications and medications for bipolar disorder, now only 67%. So there's a decrease. Same thing with schizophrenia and psychotic disorders. But then you also see increases. And not surprisingly, you see those increases also where we're seeing drugs come on the market. Also, there was a significant increase in the task force members who had ties, a 21% increase. So yes, there was a increased transparency, a disclosure policy, but despite the disclosure policy, nothing really has changed. So I would say that, when you take a look at the larger picture, that, going back to Dennis Thompson's point, that gives the impression that commercial influence are influencing decisions about what disorders will be included in the DSM, and as we'll see in a little bit when I talk about the clinical practice guidelines, how those, quote, disorders should be treated. I also like this quote by Foucault. It's not that everything is bad. It's that everything is dangerous. So we think we've developed solutions. Transparency, for example, we think of as a solution, right? Well, it's not that transparency per se is bad, but I think it's dangerous in this Foucaultian sense, in that it gives the appearance that we've done something when in fact nothing's changed. And there's a wealth of social psych research, some of it coming out of Georgetown, that shows that transparency can have its own iatrogenic effects. It can actually increase bias through what the social psychologists call moral licensing. So someone discloses their conflicts, they feel freer to be more biased. Now, I had mentioned before that I think psychiatry could be the poster child. And one of the reasons that I think psychiatry is particularly vulnerable to playing handmaiden to industry is because there are no biological markers for any of the DSM disorders. I think most people, if you polled people, would be shocked to find out that you give a diagnosis of schizophrenia, there's no scanning technique, there's no blood test. You give a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, no scanning technique, no blood test, nothing. No, it relies on a person's subjective judgment. And while certainly other biomarkers can be fungible in other areas of medicine, the fact that there are none and that it relies on a person's totally on a person's interpretation of behaviors qua symptoms makes it, I think, very vulnerable to industry influence. And some psychiatrists have acknowledged this. This is a quote from Alan Francis where he says that, even though there have been these tremendous advances in molecular biology and neuroscience, they're not relevant to psychiatry and to clinical psychiatric diagnoses. And as he says, the clearest evidence is there isn't even one biological test that was ready for inclusion or that's in the DSM-5. Again, I think most people would be surprised to find out about that. So what does that mean? Well, that leads to what many people have referred to as the false positive problem, or the overdiagnosis of diseases, disorders. So I like to use this as an example. If you have a sibling, or if you do have a sibling and you're the younger one, imagine, do you ever remember saying gosh, she really seems to blame other people for her mistakes, and she really doesn't pay attention to the rules, doesn't listen to mom and dad. Gosh, very touchy, and my personal favorite, deliberately annoyed you and your friends. Well, this would be funny, except some of you might know what the diagnosis will be. This is a DSM diagnosis. It's not new to the DSM-5. It's in the DSM-5. It was also in the DSM-4. It's oppositional defiant disorder. And so here are the actual criteria, and I use those. Those came straight from the DSM. Often loses temper, often argues with adults. I'm not going to read them. You can read them, and you require, the DSM requires 6 months or more of at least 4 of those symptoms. So you could say, okay, well the the APA has given us some symptom criteria, and they've given a time period. They've even given some level of specificity or detail. So what's the problem? I think the problem is often. Because if you remember from the previous slide, all of those refer to as often. So my often isn't necessarily Madeline's often, isn't necessarily Adrian's often. And remember, there's no biomarker, no biological test. So that's how a diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder is developed, is in terms of a person's judgment on what constitutes often loses temper, etc. Okay, so you think you're normal. Well, think again, if you haven't taken a look at the DSM-5. Adrienne talked yesterday about binge eating disorder, so I won't talk much about that, but that, as she had mentioned, is a new disorder to the DSM-5. It occurs, as I'll talk about in a moment, in the absence of anorexia or bulimia. Autism spectrum disorder, this was another controversial change where they eliminated Asperger's disorder, Rett's disorder, and childhood disintegrative disorder and put them under the umbrella term of autism spectrum disorder. And of course, whenever you have a spectrum disorder, there is the real increased risk of the false positive problem and overdiagnosis. Disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, that's a childhood disorder diagnosed only in children between the ages of 7 and 18. The APA originally wanted to call it a temper dysregulation disorder, but got a lot of pushback, and so came up with renamed it as disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. One of the concerns that I have about that is I think that's just going to be another avenue by which kids are going to be prescribed second-generation antipsychotics. So instead of getting a bipolar NOS, they'll get a disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. And in fact, as I'll show in a minute, there are RCTs for second-generation antipsychotics for 7-year-olds who have disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. Mild neurocognitive disorder, basically I think anyone over the age of 50 could potentially be diagnosed with this, the way that the DSM defines it. It's in the absence of, I'm not kidding, it's in the absence of any formal neurological, psychological testing. It's by self-report or report of the other, where you say things like, wow, you know, I'm having trouble word finding, or you know what, I'm constantly looking, where's my cell phone, do I have my keys? So, you know, maybe even younger than 50 could qualify for it. Premenstrual dysphoric disorder, that was in the appendix of the DSM-4. It's now officially in the DSM-5 under depressive disorders. And then lastly, one of the most controversial, which probably many of you have heard of and talked about, and that's the elimination of the bereavement exclusion in the, for major depressive disorder. In the DSM-4, there was a clear recognition that even if a person met the criteria for having major depressive disorder, that is having over a 2-week period having 5 symptoms of depression, that if they had lost a loved one, you should not give this diagnosis, that would be understood as grief. The DSM-5 eliminated this exclusion, and now if a person who's lost a loved one has 5 symptoms of depression over 2 weeks, can get diagnosed with major depressive disorder. Now, proponents of this have said, hey, look, there are people that are in the throes of horrific grief that we really need to treat and we need to try to help, so we need to eliminate this. The opponents said, well, wait, I think we could still do that, but the risk is that we're going to pathologize a normal human event, which is grieving. And in fact, what I'll show you, there's actually Zymbalta for grief. Zymbalta is in trial for grieving. And that, I think, is a big danger. This is, of course, binge eating disorder. You don't have anorexia or bulimia, but once a week over the last few months, these are the only 3 symptoms, as she had mentioned. If you've eaten more rapidly than normal, eaten until you're uncomfortably full, or eaten large amounts of food when not physically hungry, then you would qualify for binge eating disorder. Now, do many Americans overeat? Absolutely. But should we see this as an individual pathology? I think we need to be very careful. Yes, do people have eating issues and eating disorders? Yes. But when you have such loose and vague symptoms, you really run the risk of that false positive problem. And as a former president of the APA said, acknowledge that it's these flexible boundaries that really create opportunities for industry to promote treatments for people who wouldn't previously be seen as having a disorder. Now, this does make the pharmaceutical industry certainly happy if everyone has a disorder, but it certainly, I don't think, isn't good for public health. And in fact, as we know, in any field of medicine, the diagnosis informs the treatment. And again, as was talked about yesterday, We now have a powerful amphetamine that was approved, I think, in January of this year for binge eating disorder. And as the title from the New York Times shows, they, I think, summed it up very well, that Shire, the manufacturer of Vyvanse, first marketed the disease, and then we have the treatment for it. And, you know, I like to say, have we learned nothing from the 60s? We're going to give amphetamines to women who are saying that they're overeating. And as you'll see, there's also other drugs in trial for binge eating disorder, including, I'm pretty sure it's Cymbalta, it's an SSRI. Switching gears now, moving from the potential corruption of the diagnostic guidelines to talking about the clinical practice guidelines, because as we all know, diagnosis informs treatment. Now, in 2009, the IOM came out with a pretty strong statement in which they said, hey, conflicts of interest are a real problem. They're compromising academic medicine, CMEs, and they're compromising clinical practice guidelines. In 2011, they came out with an even stronger statement and actually had a number of recommendations. And one of the recommendations is that the chair of a clinical practice guideline should not have financial ties to industry. So the IOM came out with a very strong statement, and they said that ideally, no one on the CPG and the Guideline Development Committee should have ties. But in the unusual event that you couldn't possibly find an expert without ties, they should constitute a minority. So the IOM is clearly aware of this, and I think, you know, most people in the room are aware of the real problems with the industry influence on clinical practice guidelines. So what I'm going to be talking about are APA's practice guidelines, their latest practice guidelines for major depressive disorder. Now, I like to show this slide because people don't believe me unless I actually show this. This is on page 31 of the APA's clinical practice guideline. And I want to point out a couple things. Yes, it does say this is for major depressive disorder. For mild to moderate depression, that would be mild depression. What do we see in the far right? Yes, ECT is recommended for mild depression. They're evidence-based. They actually say, and you can go back to page 31 and see, they say, for patients who prefer it. That's really disconcerting, I think, to use that as your evidence. And also, as I'll talk about in a moment, although they do recommend psychotherapy, they recommend antidepressant medication as a first-line intervention. That's important, as a first-line intervention for mild depression. So this got me interested in, you know, okay, is this evidence-based? Well, if they're saying this, if it's evidence-based, then there's no problem. And it's a real issue because the vast majority of prescriptions for antidepressants are written by non-psychiatrist physicians who then turn to APA as a trusted resource. So the question for me is, do antidepressants work? If so, for whom? And what does the evidence tell us? Kirsch did this study that many of you are aware of in 2008 that came out in PLOS Medicine. What was really brilliant, I think, on his part is that he used a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act, because of course that predated clinicaltrials.gov. And so he looked at published and unpublished studies, and I don't think he could be more, he and his team could be more clear. He does a meta-analysis, and he says, given these data, there seems little evidence to support prescription of antidepressant medication to even the most severely depressed patients unless alternative treatments have failed to provide benefit. Okay? Fournier and JAMA got a lot of media attention, 2010. They did a meta-analysis. What do they say? Again, couldn't be more clear. Efforts should be made to clarify to clinicians and patients that there's little evidence to suggest that antidepressants produce specific pharmacological benefit for the majority of patients with less acute, severe acute depressions. What does APA say? Antidepressant medication is recommended as an initial treatment choice for patients with mild to moderate major depressive disorder. And the kicker is they cite Kirsch and Fournier to support that. So one of the other things I wanted to point out is on this clinical practice guideline, the Guideline Development Group, 100%, all of them, had ties to the manufacturers of the antidepressants, and the vast majority were key opinion leaders on the speakers' bureaus for the antidepressant medications that they're recommending in their clinical practice guideline. What do less conflicted clinical practice guidelines recommend? NICE, citing Kirsch and Fournier, addresses the harm-benefit issue and specifically says for mild depression, antidepressant medication should not be the first line for individuals with mild depression. So do recent Dutch guidelines. Just the exact quote from NICE. I want to move along here. This is a chart that my students and I did where we just looked at US as the APA's guideline, NICE's guideline, the guideline out of Spain, and the Dutch guideline, looking at what do they say for mild depression. So we're the only folks that do not recommend lifestyle interventions such as exercise for mild depression. In fact, what the APA says, if a patient with depression wishes to exercise, there's little to argue against it. That's their whole statement. Whereas NICE's guideline has pages and pages of evidence base showing the benefits of exercise. We're also the only one that recommends antidepressant medication, and other somatic therapies include ECT. And as you just saw, the APA recommends augmentation with second-generation antipsychotics if there's no improvement after 4 to 8 weeks. The other clinical practice guidelines don't do this. So I just wanted to end talking about one other thing, one other aspect that I looked at. Could the DSM-5 possibly be a vehicle for high-profit patent extensions? And so what we did is we looked at this was in 2011, 2012. We looked at the RCTs for drugs that were in the pipeline for disorders that were supposed to be included in the DSM, which is interesting because how could they know that they were going to get into the DSM? That begs another question, but at any rate, just wanted to show you of the 13 trials that we found. You see bereavement-related depressions in Balta, complicated grief, another antidepressant. Binge eating disorder is great, no pun intended, but it's like spaghetti, throwing spaghetti against the wall trying to find a drug, right? Because you have everything from a cognitive enhancer to an antidepressant to a, quote, mood stabilizer to see if it will work, as well as the amphetamine. Again, just very quickly, and what we also saw the clear connection with was patents expired or about to expire. And I would say that that I think Zimbalta is today's Prozac in the sense that Eli Lilly has a vested interest. It accounted for 24% of Lilly's profits, and the patent expired a year ago. And so I wasn't surprised to see that it's in, in trial for major depression for grief. So these findings suggest that I think financial conflicts of interest shift the direction of the research to commercial interests and not representing the best science. Now, is this, I've talked to people when I point out the quotes from the Kirsch and Fournier and how they're misquoted, and is that intentional or not? I honestly don't know. I'm jaded, but I don't know. I really think that it's guild interest. I think that the guideline development members, who are all APA members with industry ties, are just not aware of those implicit biases, the way in which they are unconsciously motivated to interpret in terms of favorability towards drugs. This was, Regier is one of the co-chairs of the DSM-5, and when a study that Shelley Krimsky and I did came out that looked at these ties, he said, what's the problem? There's this assumption that a tie with a company is evidence of bias, but these people, DSM panel members, can be objective, which I find fascinating. Here you have a profession, like my profession. We're supposed to be, focused on the human psyche and on understanding unconscious processes, and the idea that a group of people could be objective when none of us really could under those circumstances is interesting. And that's why I like Upton Sinclair's statement that it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. Thank you.